It starts with an ordinary morning in Nairobi, shopkeepers lifting their metal shutters, bus drivers warming their engines, mothers rushing their children to school. The city is alive, familiar, predictable. And then, like a crack in the quiet radios across the capital, replay a sentence that freezes people in their tracks. That ocean belongs to me. In the future, we are going to have wars. The words aren't coming from a distant adversary. They're from President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, Kenya's neighbor, trading partner, and longtime regional ally. For many Kenyans, especially the older generation who still remember the tremors of past East African tensions, that single sentence felt like a distant thunder announcing a storm. It wasn't just what he said, but when he said it. The region is struggling with inflation, political anxiety, and a fragile sense of stability. Kenya's coastlines are its lifeline economically, culturally, strategically. So when a head of state suggests future wars over access to the Indian Ocean, it echoes far beyond politics. It hits the nerves of ordinary families who rely on peace to survive. And then, almost too quickly to be coincidence, a Ugandan military delegation quietly lands in Nairobi. Not for combat, not for confrontation, but for meetings, closed-door sessions, base tours, courtesy visits. The kind of military diplomacy that raises more questions than answers when it happens at such a sensitive moment. So what is really happening here is Museveni speaking in metaphors, playing domestic politics, or signaling a deeper frustration. And why did his soldiers step onto Kenyan soil right after he spoke of war? These are questions East Africa is whispering about, and the world is watching closely. Before we go deeper, I'd love to hear from you, especially those of you who've lived long enough to understand how quickly peace can turn fragile. Do you believe President Museveni's words were simply symbolic, or a warning we should take seriously? If you value honest analysis and truth-focused reporting, please subscribe and share this video with someone who cares about stability in Africa. When President Yoweri Museveni made his now viral declaration that ocean belongs to me, I am entitled to that ocean. In the future, we are going to have wars. It didn't just stir a political debate. It rippled through East Africa like a shockwave. People who were watching the interview live said they felt the air change. Even seasoned analysts paused, unsure whether to treat the statement as a threat, a provocation, or a moment of emotional honesty from a leader facing internal political pressure. For many Kenyans, those words were deeply unsettling. The Indian Ocean is not simply water or geography to them. It is the artery that keeps the nation's economy alive, the gateway for food, fuel, medicine, and global trade. And hearing a neighboring president speak of war over access to it awakened fears that older generations remember all too well: blockades, shortages, and border tensions from decades past. Yet the real twist came not from Museveni's words, but from what happened next. Just hours after his statement began circulating online, something unusual unfolded quietly at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. A Ugandan military delegation arrived in Nairobi not in secret, but without public fanfare. Kenya Defense Forces confirmed their presence only after photos leaked from the airport. The delegation, led by Major General Francis Takarwa, the deputy commander of Uganda's land forces, had been scheduled for an official benchmarking exercise focused on welfare services for soldiers and their families. On paper, it sounded harmless, routine even. Militaries regularly exchange knowledge and visit each other for training or evaluation. But the timing made many Kenyans uneasy. Households gathered around evening news broadcasts asked the same question: why today, why, right after the "we are going to have war" statement? As the delegation moved through Nairobi, their itinerary raised further speculation. They toured Moi Air Base in Eastleigh, one of Kenya's most strategically important military facilities. They held closed-door meetings with senior Kenyan officers whose faces were serious in every photograph. No casual smiles, no ceremonial warmth. Every image felt calculated, cautious. The Ugandan officers then traveled to Embakasi to visit the KDF Defense Forces Welfare Department, and even the DFWS Mall, a little-known shopping and support center for military families. These visits, while perfectly legitimate, felt strangely intimate for a week filled with diplomatic confusion. It was like watching two neighbors having tea the morning after one of them shouted threats over the fence. Polite on the surface, but undeniably tense. Kenya's public reaction grew louder by the hour. On social media, many condemned Museveni's remarks as reckless and provocative. Older Kenyans who lived through regional turmoil in the 1970s and 1980s expressed a heavier kind of fear, not anger, but dread. They know what border conflicts cost. They know that misunderstandings between leaders can take decades to repair. Meanwhile, inside Uganda, supporters of the president defended him. They insisted his words were metaphorical, a commentary on inequality geography and the frustrations of landlocked nations. Others said he was speaking to his domestic base, reinforcing strength as he campaigns for what he calls his final term. But even among Ugandans, the mood was mixed. Some wondered whether the timing of the military visit to Kenya was meant to calm tensions, or demonstrate confidence, or simply show that the two militaries remain aligned despite political noise. Kenya's government eventually issued a statement saying Museveni's remarks had been taken out of context, urging the public to remain calm. But on the ground, people felt the opposite. When a president talks about war and his army steps into a neighboring capital, the same week no amount of diplomatic language can erase the unease. The events of those days, the words, the visit, the whispers formed a pattern that nobody could ignore. The tension reached its peak when Kenyans realized something far more complicated was unfolding beneath the surface. Museveni's dramatic statement had already rattled the region, but the true climax came from the uncomfortable contradiction that followed. Uganda's president spoke of future wars, yet his army was walking the streets of Nairobi being welcomed into military bases, shaking hands with senior Kenyan commanders. It was a paradox so sharp that even veteran diplomats struggled to interpret it. For Kenyan citizens, especially those who remember the scars of East Africa's Cold War-era conflicts, the contradiction was terrifying. 1 minute headlines screamed, Uganda threatens war over Indian Ocean. The next minute, television screens showed Ugandan officers in crisp uniforms attending meetings in Kenya's most secure installations. This wasn't just confusing. It felt like the kind of geopolitical moment where a single miscalculation could shift a region's fate. Inside living rooms across Nairobi, older Kenyans lowered the volume on their televisions and whispered to each other with worry, what if this isn't a coincidence? What if something bigger is happening? And to understand why the fear felt so real, one must remember East Africa's history. Museveni's Uganda has gone to war with neighbors before twice, with Tanzania in the 1960s and 1970s suffering heavy losses. Many Kenyans still recall stories from relatives who lived through those turbulent years. For them, war isn't an abstract idea. It is a memory, a wound. So when analysts appeared on Kenyan news programs, tensions rose even further. Some experts tried to calm the public, saying Museveni was merely under domestic pressure and using fiery language to energize his voter base. But others were far less reassuring. They argued that access to the sea has always been a strategic obsession for landlocked nations, and Uganda's growing frustration could easily spill over into real geopolitical confrontation. One analyst delivered a statement that resonated across social media for a president to speak of war at this particular moment. It is deeply dangerous. At the same time, diplomatic reactions from Kenya were notably cautious. Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary Korir Singwe held a press briefing to defuse the situation, insisting that Museveni's remarks were metaphorical, not literal. His tone was carefully measured, almost delicate, the tone of a government trying to avoid escalating a fire that it cannot predict or control. But while the official statements urged calm, Kenya's defense establishment behaved differently. Behind the scenes, military officers increased monitoring of the Ugandan delegation's movements. Cooperation continued, but with visible vigilance. Meetings remained cordial but reserved. Guards were doubled. Protocol was strict. Everyone understood the stakes. During their tour, the Ugandan officers met Major General Bernard Waliaula, Kenya's Air Force commander. The encounter was polite yet serious. Photos from the event show stiff body language, the kind that suggests cooperation, but not comfort. General Waliaula encouraged the Ugandans to study Kenya's welfare model to improve the lives of their own soldiers back home. Yet even in that diplomatic warmth, observers sensed something unspoken. Was this truly a routine exchange or a subtle reassurance meant to prevent a diplomatic rift? As the delegation continued to visit Embakasi and the Defense Forces Welfare Services headquarters, commentators debated openly whether these military exchanges were masking deeper conversations. Some believed Uganda wanted to demonstrate goodwill after Museveni's inflammatory remarks. Others suspected the meeting served as a strategic check-in, a way to gauge Kenya's reaction posture and readiness. Either way, the region felt the tension. Even those who dismissed Museveni's words as rhetorical were forced to confront an uneasy truth. Timing shapes meaning, and the timing of Uganda's military visit changed everything. For many Kenyans, the real fear was not that war was imminent, but that the line between political theatrics and real military signaling had blurred. And in a region where misunderstandings have triggered deadly conflicts before, this blurring was the most alarming sign of all. While diplomats and generals exchanged handshakes in Nairobi, the real weight of Museveni's words fell on ordinary people. The millions of civilians whose daily lives depend on stability between Kenya and Uganda. In the homes of Mombasa's fishermen, in the long-haul trucks lining the Eldoret Highway, in the busy stalls of Gakamba Market, the reaction was overwhelmingly the same fear wrapped in uncertainty. For Kenya's coastal communities, Museveni's claim that ocean belongs to me hit especially hard. Fishermen who rely on calm waters to feed their families wondered what a future war over the ocean might mean for them. Many older men whose fathers lived through past maritime disputes spoke quietly about the fragility of peace. When your livelihood depends on the sea, even a metaphor can feel like a threat. In Nairobi, shop owners worried about a different consequence: the economic chain that connects Kenya and Uganda. Every day, thousands of tons of goods cross their shared border: fuel, maize, cement, medicine, cooking oil. The moment Museveni's statement went viral, Kenyan traders began asking suppliers whether delays were expected, whether Uganda might react, whether political tension would spill into trade restrictions. For a country already battling inflation, even the whisper of a disruption was frightening. On the Ugandan side, a different kind of pressure built in the streets. Museveni's supporters framed his comments as courage, a bold voice for a landlocked nation tired of depending on neighbors for access to international markets. They celebrated his rhetoric as patriotism. But others, especially Uganda's business community, worried that such fiery language could backfire, harming cross-border commerce with Kenya, their largest trading partner. The tension created an emotional split inside Uganda itself, pride on one side, anxiety on the other. Meanwhile, Kenya's political sphere became a battleground of interpretations. Opposition leaders accused the government of appearing passive in the face of a direct provocation. They argued that the administration should have issued a stronger, more assertive response. Government officials pushed back, saying escalation would only inflame a situation that required calm diplomacy. The divide quickly became a matter of national debate. Should Kenya confront Museveni's rhetoric or neutralize it silently? For the ordinary Kenyan, neither option felt reassuring. The arrival of the Ugandan military delegation sharpened the unease further. Social media commentators questioned whether Kenya had been blindsided. Others demanded transparency. What exactly was discussed in those closed-door meetings? Why were the visits so extensive at such a politically sensitive moment? And then there was the historical memory, the emotional weight carried by families who lived through East Africa's previous conflicts. Older Kenyans, particularly those in rural areas, recalled stories of the Uganda-Tanzania wars and the losses they inflicted. For them, Museveni's words were not abstract political rhetoric. They were echoes of a past that no one wants to relive. The fear was not just about war itself, but about miscalculation, the risk that a symbolic statement could transform into a diplomatic crisis and then into something far worse. Residents in border towns like Busia and Malaba expressed worry that their communities, always the first to feel the tremors of regional conflict, would again become flashpoints if tensions rose. Across Kenya, religious leaders, civil society groups, and community elders began calling for calm. They urged both governments to clarify their positions, reaffirm peace, and strengthen cooperation. Their voices reflected a deeper truth: civilians always bear the heaviest cost when leaders speak recklessly. In the end, the political and social consequences of Museveni's words were immediate and profound. What began as a single statement had grown into a wave of anxiety that crossed borders, markets, and generations, a reminder that in East Africa, peace is precious and stability is fragile. From Washington to Brussels, Museveni's declaration did not go unnoticed. In fact, to many observers in global security circles, it was the kind of statement that sets off quiet alarms, not because war is imminent, but because rhetoric like this often signals deeper regional fractures. And in a strategically sensitive corridor like East Africa, those fractures matter. For the United States, Kenya has long been one of the continent's most dependable partners. American military cooperation, intelligence sharing, trade routes, counterterrorism missions, all of them run through Kenyan territory or rely on Kenyan stability. So, when Uganda's president suggests that future wars could erupt over access to the Indian Ocean, Washington pays attention. Not publicly, not through dramatic press conferences, but through intelligence assessments and confidential cables that flow between embassies and the Pentagon. From the U.S. perspective, the Indian Ocean is more than a body of water. It is a major artery for global shipping, a route used by American naval forces, and a strategic connector between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Any indication that territorial disputes might arise in this region is taken seriously. Senior analysts in the State Department understand that political theatrics in East Africa can quickly escalate if not managed with steady diplomacy. Europe, too, has concerns. The European Union relies heavily on Kenyan ports for trade and humanitarian logistics. Brussels has invested billions in regional stability initiatives, infrastructure, and peacekeeping support. For European partners, Museveni's comments raised questions about whether East Africa might be entering a more competitive nationalistic era, one in which long-standing borders and agreements could be contested. In a world already strained by conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the last thing global powers want is a new flashpoint. Across Africa, the reactions were mixed but telling. Rwanda, Tanzania, and South Sudan quietly monitored the situation, understanding that any decline in Kenya-Uganda relations would affect trade, transportation, and regional bloc negotiations. Leaders within the African Union have heard such language before and know it can either be ignored as political showmanship or become the spark that ignites border disputes. Yet some African observers pointed out an increasingly relevant trend, a rising wave of discussions about sovereignty, independence, and regional power dynamics. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have contributed to a broader continental mood in which leaders speak more boldly about autonomy. While Traoré's message centers on dignity and internal reform, Museveni's approach appears sharper, more confrontational, more rooted in strategic frustration. Still, both reflect a shifting geopolitical climate in Africa, one where global powers can no longer assume calm or predictability. China, a major economic player in both Kenya and Uganda, has its own concerns. Beijing relies on East African stability for its belt and road investments, railways, ports, highways. Any disruption would threaten billions of dollars in infrastructure projects. Quietly, Chinese advisors have encouraged dialogue, knowing that long-term economic influence depends on peace, not militarism. Ultimately, the international community sees Museveni's statement for what it is: a sign that East Africa is entering a period of recalibration. Old alliances are being tested. Economic dependencies are under pressure. Leaders are redefining their roles in a continent undergoing rapid political change. For global powers, the message is unmistakable. When a president talks of war and his soldiers appear in a neighboring capital days later, this is no longer just a regional issue. It becomes an international concern. In moments like these, history reminds us that great conflicts rarely begin with marching armies. More often, they begin with a sentence, a declaration spoken too casually, a threat wrapped in metaphor, a moment when powerful men forget that entire nations live beneath the weight of their words. Museveni's statement about the Indian Ocean, followed so closely by the arrival of Ugandan soldiers in Nairobi, is one of those moments, a moment that demands attention, caution, and the kind of wisdom only time and experience can teach. Because the truth is, this East Africa has lived through enough hardship to understand how quickly peace can fracture. A misinterpreted phrase, a defensive response, a political rally spiraling out of control, and suddenly a region built on trade cooperation and shared history finds itself staring into the eyes of chaos. Civilians always pay the highest price. It is never the presidents or generals who lose their homes, their businesses, or their sons. It is the quiet families in border towns, the traders who depend on open roads, the fishermen who rely on safe waters. That is why moments like this matter so deeply. The world is watching not because East Africa is weak, but because East Africa has become strategically essential. Kenya carries the weight of regional stability. Uganda influences security across the Great Lakes. Tanzania, South Sudan, Rwanda all feel the tremors when diplomacy falters. And beyond Africa, Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Riyadh understand that one spark in this region could ripple far beyond its borders. As Africa changes, as leaders speak more boldly about sovereignty, justice, and independence, the political landscape becomes more sensitive. Across the continent, figures like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are reshaping national identity and raising global expectations about African leadership. The entire world of Africa news reflects this shift, a continent asserting itself, refusing to be spoken, for refusing to be underestimated. But in moments of rising confidence, the risk of confrontation also rises if diplomacy fails. And so here we are standing at a crossroads where words matter as much as actions, where timing can determine peace or instability, where a single leader's frustration can unsettle millions. Now I turn to you, especially those of you who have witnessed the cost of conflict in your own lifetime. Do you believe East Africa is entering a dangerous era of territorial disputes, or is this simply political theater gone too far, and should the region demand greater accountability when leaders speak of war? Your perspective matters. Your voice matters. If you care about truth, sovereignty, and the future of African stability, please share this video and subscribe to support honest reporting in a noisy world. Because peace must be protected long before the first shot is fired.